Today, we're going to be hearing from a panel and some discussion around emerging AI technologies for inclusion of underserved populations. But before we get started, I wanted to give you a little more background on our organization. In case you're not aware, ADSA is a community of data science researchers and educators who take responsibility for a just, equitable future where data science approaches are thoughtfully applied in all domains for the benefit of all. You'll see on the bottom of this slide a QR code. You're welcome to use your phone, snap that, and find out more about us on our website. So with that, I will turn it over to Dhireesha Kudithipudi, who is professor, endowed chair, and director of the AI Consortium at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Dhireesha?
Thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. We have a phenomenal group of scientists here with us who are all leading researchers in the Matrix AI Consortium, and they come from both UTSA and UT Health San Antonio. They are here today to share with us how AI technologies can help in inclusion of underserved populations. With San Antonio being a minority-majority city, and UTSA housing more than 65% minority and first-generation Hispanic students, this is a research area that is very close to our hearts. On one hand, AI technologies today have made incredible strides, whether it's in health or in healthcare. And with an influx of big data, it has the potential to benefit large demographics. But on the other hand, it has really marked blind spots when deployed in real world, because these models often fail when we present data from underrepresented populations, or in some cases, different social classes and cultures. So in today's panel, our panelists will discuss how curating new data sets that are more representative of minorities and other AI modeling techniques can help us in designing inclusive systems and make progress towards designing AI that works for all rather than for few. So our panelists will first provide their opening statements, and then we will have the floor open for questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Amina Qutub. She's an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at UTSA, and also a research thrust lead in the Matrix AI Consortium. She uses AI and data science to characterize biological communication on all scales and interpret the accompanying experimental and health data. Dr. Kutu.
Thank you, Dhireesha. Also for opening up this panel, which highlights an ongoing challenge, which also was recently highlighted by Bloomberg Press. If you look at the stats in terms of vaccination rates across the country, this schematic, this data visualization shows that there's a far lower share of Hispanic people who are vaccinated compared to the proportion of Hispanic residents across states. And just recently in this month, Texas is now the only US state where white people aren't the largest vaccinated population. If you look at the reverse, if you look at this data visualization a different way, you can see that there's a far greater proportion of overall white people vaccinated. But this highlights a bigger issue when we're designing research-based sample sizes. I want to illustrate this in a recent survey that for my research we conducted in the middle of COVID-19, the pandemic last year. And we had a broad-based survey where we were asking people to identify different behaviors that could influence their cognitive health during the pandemic. And as you can see from the results of the demographic survey, while we have a distribution of ages, we're skewed in terms of the age brackets. And additionally, the representative population in terms of the racial demographics and also the educational demographics are more reflective perhaps of the researchers conducting the studies than they are of the general population. And this is an overarching problem in research that's conducted from academic institutions and institutions nationwide. And the question that we have for this panel is, how do we start to address this? And I can share a few ways that we're starting to address this within the Matrix Consortium and more broadly across UTSA and UT Health Sciences, and also more specifically within my research projects. You can see from this schematic that we have increased the number of Hispanic represented individuals who are part of a large-scale human subjects research study in my lab, where we're tracking individuals' behavior longitudinally over time. One of the things that's interesting about looking at this data a priori before you start developing artificial intelligence algorithms to interpret the data is by understanding where you're skewed in terms of your representation. One of the other things to note about a lot of the research studies where you have volunteers volunteering for scientific research is that they're also predominantly skewed towards females who are more willing, it seems, for a lot of studies to volunteer. What we did find is we went out and recruited a larger proportion of Hispanic volunteers for our project. And we noticed that they're not equally represented across different health demographics. So you can see in the bottom figure here in D, we're representing a large portion of very healthy Hispanic individuals. Our elite athletes that we recruited happen to be far more dominated by Hispanic individuals, and their sleep representations were quite different. You can see this from the heat maps on the bottom right. So we were looking at initially at a biased or imbalanced data set, and yet we were having representative populations from across demographics, just they weren't represented across the different health demographics the way we wanted to initially design the study. So one of the things we did is step back and think about what are the questions that we're trying to address in this particular study. And this is not only in my domain, it's more broadly in the field of neuroscience. The idea that each individual can be considered their own control over time, and also the way you look at diversity can be broadened. And one of the ways we look at diversity in this instance is where are people starting in terms of their historical representation in their behaviors, in their cognitive patterns, in their cognitive scores, and in their sleep. So what we have is a year worth of sleep data. We have cognitive test scores across 9 metrics. And we have metrics of people's daily activity, which we monitor. And from that, we look at them related to their own controls. In a sense, you're biasing your data in a different way. You're not comparing one person from a different race to another, or you're not comparing a gender across a different demographics. You're comparing them to their own self. But the time is the differential here. So these neurosignatures bring up another issue. You're pinpointing individuals by different rubrics that identify them across metrics which can be uniquely theirs, but yet are not tied to individual information that would be identifiers commonly known to data science, like IDs or social security numbers or DNA. We're not doing it that way. We're doing it by behaviors. So this brings up some other questions that I want to address in this panel, in that when we're identifying people by individual metrics across these many different degrees, if we can design different control groups. So we can design control groups based off of the starting point of people within a broad range of initial spatial memory brackets, or initial verbal memory brackets, or initial sleep stages. And then when we design a cohort, we're not looking at balancing gender, or we're not looking at balancing race, we're looking at balancing health metrics more broadly, and we're comparing people to themselves over time. This is what we're trying to do across different scales. So from the cellular all the way up to the behavioral level, where each individual is representative of themselves across these scales. But that brings up yet another point. How do you bring back what you're missing? So what I showed you in the beginning is that we're biased in terms of the racial demographics, we're biased in terms of the gender demographics for the study. So in the process of us looking at a different choice of how we design the studies, whether they're N of ones, whether they're longitudinal studies, another thing that we're looking at is how do we bootstrap the data to make up for the imbalance that we have in our initial data collection. So these are metrics and methods that I want to bring up during the Q&A, during the panel discussion. Another thing that we're doing is we're looking at developing optimization algorithms so that our test and training sets are representative of each other. So as you can imagine, like a genetic algorithm which pairs across levels of distributions for sleep, for gender, for age, for protein expression levels in the blood, you have the same demographics represented in your test and your training set. But those of themselves require their own algorithms. Another thing to do is make sure that the way that we're handling the data is understandable. Each line of code can be explained and interpreted by a broad audience. And so this is a part of the overall umbrella of what explainable AI is attempting to do. So these are all parts of where we're going with the discussion points for today's panel. I want to finish there. I have backup slides on more details of what we're doing, but just to open up the idea that we can think of new ways of handling imbalanced data, of representing people by their being their own controls and study them longitudinally, and thinking about other ways to incorporate a more equitable data set in addressing AI and how it can be used in the future. So I think Mohamad and Paula are next. Dhireesha.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Qutub. Dr. Habes is our next panelist, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Radiology and Epidemiology. And he's also the director of the Neuroimaging Core at the Biggs Institute and a core member in the Matrix AI Consortium. He develops advanced AI and machine learning models to implement image-based markers for capturing brain aging and neurodegenerative related changes. Dr. Habes.
So my name is Mohamad Habes. I'm assistant professor of radiology and epidemiology at the University of Texas Health San Antonio. I'm also co-leading the neuroimaging core of the South Texas Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, the only ADRC in Texas, funded by NIH. And what we are doing at the Biggs Institute Neuroimaging Core is simply to combat and understand neurodegenerative disorders using neuroimaging data. That means collecting, acquiring MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, as well as positron imaging tomography that are capturing different aspects of the neurodegenerative disorders. Neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. Those are large machines that need specific facilities to function at all. And the resulting scans out of those machines are also large data that needs to be archived and that need to be analyzed in a way to tease out the biologically meaningful information. This is what we are building here, analytic tools that can capture or tease out this biological meaningful information. And this is where AI comes into application and development in two main directions. The first is to capture lesions that are associated with age or with disease, like white matter hyperintensities, like stroke, like bleeds, enlarged perivascular spaces, lacunes. It's a long list. And in those kind of lesions, typically, we are talking about studies with thousands of MRI scans. So the quantification of those lesions manually is almost impossible. You need automated tools to quantify them and to do the job, reduce the human error. And we have published, for example, here in a study in the study of health in Pomerania with more than 2,000 subjects, the spatial distributions of these lesions. This is mainly white population. We have trained AI tools also to capture iron in the brain, and we are applying these tools in studies like the MESA study with more than 1,000 subjects. But overall, the data representation from minorities is not integrated yet into these models, although we know that they have differences in terms of lesion distribution and risk factors that might lead to differences in their patterns. But yeah, again, I mean, we are just starting to know about that. The second application is to see for unseen patterns, let me call it that way. If we look into two MRI scans of an old subject versus a subject with Alzheimer's disease, it might be difficult to distinguish between both. However, with AI tools that we have developed, we can tell what is normal aging versus what is Alzheimer's disease. These kind of tools we have applied, validated in more than 8,000 scans. This is a study that we have published in Alzheimer's and dementia this year, showing nice concept of brain aging charts and brain aging trajectories. The data that is not published yet is showing that actually minorities have differences in terms of aging trajectories. So this data is mainly white, non-Hispanic whites, but with the new data that we have started to collect, we start to learn about differences between ethnicities in terms of aging and neurodegenerative disease trajectories. Well, as mentioned, I mean, most of the data that has been collected so far is representing the white population. And in our neuroimaging core, we are aware of that. So we have started multiple projects in which we are recruiting and focusing on the Hispanics population, which is the majority in San Antonio. A study in which we are leading is diverse PCID. The goal of this study is to understand the neurodegenerative sequelae of white matter lesions. And for that, we are collecting MRI scans as well as blood serum samples from 200 Hispanics. Another study is called Gait IQ. We are collecting MRI, PET, as well as gait measures to come up with high dimensional framework that hopefully is going to provide us a preclinical Alzheimer's disease signature. Also, we are focusing here on Hispanics. Another study recently funded by the San Antonio Medical Foundation. It's a collaborative study with Dhireesha and with South Texas VA. The goal of this study is to recruit 100 patients and collect MRI as well as EEG for these patients to distinguish and understand differences in dementia patterns between Alzheimer's disease, which is well known, versus other dementia subtypes like Lewy body disease or frontotemporal dementia. And yes, with that, I would like to conclude and come to my summary statement that AI is a key tool in our research, and we are starting to collect data towards more representation of Hispanics in our data sets to train models and to generalize our models across all ethnicities. So with that, I would like also to thank my lab, collaborators, and our team, and give you the mic again.
Thank you, Mohamad. Our third panelist is Dr. Paula Shireman. She's a professor in the departments of surgery and microbiology, immunology, and molecular genetics. And she's also a research thrust lead in the Matrix AI Consortium. Her team uses data science and data to transform healthcare and to improve outcomes for frail and low socioeconomic status patients using predictive modeling as well as machine learning. Dr. Shireman.
Thank you, Dhireesha. Here we go. These are some of my disclosures and some of the research funding that we have. I'm going to comment this from a very clinical perspective. I'm a vascular surgeon and deal with electronic health records and know the foibles and the pain and suffering actually of clinicians who use them and how they were really originally designed as a billing system and really have not advanced nearly as much as they should have to actually focus on patient care. So there are multiple challenges to algorithm development. And I think one of the most important is data quality issues. And this is very common in medical data, misclassifications. And algorithms are often developed on a single institution's data, which by definition is incomplete. I'm a surgeon. If I operate on someone and I think, wow, I've done a great job, but they go down the street and they get admitted to a hospital that's not mine, then I don't know what I don't know. So can you overcome that? Sure. You can do algorithms and those can be developed on claims data, which then you know all the hospitals and clinicians that have touched the patient. However, claims data lacks the granularity of electronic health record data, and also ICD-9 and 10 codes are used vastly differently in different regions. And so when you're comparing patients who are treated in different regions, it may not it's really not easy to do. There is also a huge problem with portability of algorithms due to differences in patient populations. And algorithms are developed in ideal worlds with nicely annotated data, hopefully clean data. And when they actually bump up with real world scenarios, they often fail to perform. So there's also big challenges to clinical implementation. So you've developed this wonderful algorithm, what next? Well, it does require clinical validation and assessing algorithm performance in multiple real world settings. And it has to be trusted by both providers and patients, or really anyone who's using the algorithm. And it has to be user friendly. It's not easy to leave the electronic health record, go to some website, put in a bunch of data. Guess what? That is not going to get used. ML output has to be user-friendly, interpretable, and most importantly, actionable. You can build predictive models and say this person has high risk and won't do well. Well, that's not very useful, is it? Is there something that we can do to alter the care pathway or do something different so that the chances are better of them having a good outcome? And integration into clinical workflows is very, very challenging. Inclusive data. And I put a big question mark here because that is a huge challenge. There was a very intriguing study in JAMA by Kaushal and Associates, where they basically looked at all the ML algorithms that were published in the literature, and that they, from US cohorts, and that predominantly the patients resided in California, Massachusetts, and New York. So not only do we have problems with diversity of minority status, but we also have problems with diversity of Midwest and Deep South and other areas of the country. And the authors of this study were very skeptical that these algorithms that were developed on one coast or the other would actually apply to the vast majority of patients not living in those regions. Race and ethnicity is often missing or incorrect within medical data. So when we're trying to say, well, what proportion do we have of Hispanics or African Americans or any other, it could be wrong. And there's often very large missing classifications that could very much alter data. I think a real problem and something that we struggle with is socioeconomic status. Especially in electronic health records and in health data, it's missing. It's not there. And we often use, and our research team uses proxies. We tend to use the area deprivation index, which happens to be at a block group level, which is about 1,000 patients. However, most studies use county and zip code level because it's easier. But let's think about this. How many people are the average of their county or the average of their zip code? I live in downtown San Antonio in King William, in a very affluent area. My zip code, when we look at the distressed community index, puts me at the just one below the most highly deprived group. When we look at my block group, then I'm one below the most affluent group. So size definitely matters when we're looking at populations and trying to estimate their socioeconomic status. Healthcare disparities are propagated in machine learning algorithms using data sets with low representation of minorities, and even with clinician treatment bias. If a healthcare system where the clinicians are treating one class of patient differently and the outcomes are affected by that, then the algorithm learns that, and that also propagates the bias. I think something else that is very important is the local context. Areas and geographic regions are vastly different. And I use San Antonio as an example. We're a very mature Hispanic community. We have a large population of immigrants, but we also have Hispanics that have lived in San Antonio for generations. San Antonio is a very bilingual city. I would submit that a person who only speaks Spanish living in San Antonio will actually get along pretty well, because most businesses, healthcare systems intentionally hire bilingual people so that Spanish-speaking people are taken care of. And that may not happen, say, somewhere in the Midwest where they don't have a big Hispanic-speaking population. On the other hand, if the patient only speaks Arabic, then they're going to have a very difficult time navigating and living in San Antonio. So some of the things that we try to do with our data is, get large data sets and that are enriched with minority populations. But once again, being a minority Hispanic in, say, somewhere in Indiana versus San Antonio is a very, very different experience. And with that, I will hand it back to Dhireesha and look forward to the panel discussion. These are my references.
Thank you, Paula. We'll open up the floor for questions. I see that there are already a few questions coming up in the chat window. Before I get to those, I just wanted to start with an opening question. Looking at all your presentations, you're coming from a very diverse disciplinary background in a sense. Like Amina is engineer or a data scientist who is using AI, and whereas Mohamad is an imaging specialist who is using and developing new AI models. And Paula, you're coming as a clinician that is using predictive modeling and AI in your research. So how do you ensure that across these three disciplinary or the multiple disciplines that you're coming in from, that the data that you're collecting is representative? And what are some of the striking challenges you see with that? You alluded to that a little bit in your opening statements, but maybe if you could piece it out a little bit for the audience, that'd be great. Amina?
Yeah, I can start. The first part was in recruiting. There is a bias for research studies in the ability to recruit for biomedical research, to be able to recruit a diverse group. And part of it is building trust with communities of minority communities, which haven't worked closely with biomedical fields or research studies before. And so to get around that, partially I enlisted my students who are quite diverse, the younger population, and fortunately at UTSA, there is a great diversity in our student population. And I asked them to help in recruiting and to talk to we went out to different locations where we could help recruit minorities. And we had to do more of we had to build a relationship to help in that first part in recruiting and build trust. Paula and Mohamad, you might also be able to speak to that in the first part, in the recruitment of individuals for the study.
Yes, I agree completely. I mean, one big burden in our research is that imaging costs a lot, and you need to travel to the specific locations where those facilities are do exist. So we are lucky here in San Antonio. I mean that we have those facilities, but then the challenge of the recruitment, I agree with Amina completely on that. There is also a kind of cultural burden with some diseases that can be seen as normal in some populations. Like if you are older and you are forgetting, that's okay. It's just because you are old. So awareness is an important concept that we are working on. We try to raise the awareness between the populations that Alzheimer's disease is a horrible disease to live with. You don't want to have it. It's not just cancer that is going to kill people. There are also other diseases that are as bad as cancer, but they are progressing slower in a way that you do not realize that the impact quickly as you see that with other diseases. So what we do for that, and in terms of the recruitment, we are lucky at the Peaks Institute and the South Texas ADRC that we have a recruitment core, so enrollment and recruitment core. So there is a specific team who is working on that, and they are using media. They are going to churches to increase awareness about the disease, and trying to get more people excited about our work. And hey, come and let us work together and get rid of this disease.
It's a real challenge. I use medical records, and For example, San Antonio has a very small African-American population. I can't make it more. So how do we balance that? Some of the things that we do is, and I think with any institution, when you're talking about the diversity, I do like what Amina was talking about, being a longitudinal control of yourself, because everyone is different. Hispanics are different from others. Everything is different. So it's not easy to find what you would say would be appropriate controls. We try to use, first of all, very broad data that isn't necessarily ours, and develop algorithms on what we would really say truly large data, 20, 30, 40 million people, which really no institution has that large of population. And then what we're trying to do is transfer learning to then take what's been learned on truly big data and then apply it to different populations, such as San Antonio. We also work with the University of North Carolina, which in essence is like a mirror image of San Antonio. They have a very, very small Hispanic population, but a relatively large African-American population. And we're just the opposite. So taking these algorithms and seeing how they are different in UNC with a vastly different patient population as they are in San Antonio is one way we're trying to balance these issues, but it is really a very hard challenge.
Thank you for pointing that. So in general, I see that though there are efforts in trying to make the data more representative, there are significant barriers that still researchers face in collecting these data corpus. So as a follow-on to that, we have a question from the audience. This is from Australia, coming from Australia. So the question is, what are your thoughts about the difficulty of representing social groups whose identities are not necessarily under discrete categories, either gender diverse, fluidity, or mixed race, and whose identities are not yet captured in data? For example, medical records ask only for sex, but not gender. Paula, you alluded to this a little bit in your opening statement. Maybe you could start off the discussion.
So some of those are now being added. So in addition to sex, gender, and gender identity, I will say that most of those fields are missing, but those are now being collected as an issue. I think there's also very, very many populations that are certainly not representative. And I think basically race and ethnicity is a social construct. The genetics is so vastly different because we are a melting pot. So I would suggest that most of us are mixed race in one way or another. So this is where the N of 1 and the genomics and precision medicine, I think, ultimately will be very important in how we treat people and understand what diseases that they're most at risk for, that goes well beyond race and ethnicity.
Thank you. So I think there is another question from the audience earlier in regarding to this data collection processes itself. Are there biases in participants by race, for example, when you're collecting these data in the research studies? Is it something more common or pervasive in academia, or are these biases the same, better, or worse in other sectors?
Dhireesha, I sent a link to a Georgetown social paper, social policy paper, and it's describing that it's within broadly the people who tend to volunteer for studies fit a certain demographic more than others. Mm-hmm. So it's behoven on the researchers who are designing the studies to partially go out and reach a broader audience through different methods. I can say for our study, we are partially tracking behavior. And so you're asking people whether they're willing to have a recording daily. And that for some individuals, they were very hesitant to have that type of data of their own behavior tracked, and other demographics, they would have less of a reason to be resistant, or they wouldn't have an issue with being tracked. So I think there is not only just an issue of reaching out to the demographics that you want to recruit, but also making sure that you have in place the data science methodologies to ensure that you have security of the data and that you can share that in a way where your broad audience trusts that you're not going to identify them in a way which could harm their health longitudinally or their applications. I think, yeah, yes, absolutely. So it's a comment in the chat. It's definitely a hard balance between protecting against biases and making sure that you represent them and represent all groups in research.
Thank you. So all of you have kind of alluded to the front end of this pipeline of like how you ensure that the data you're collecting is more representative. But then comes the next phase of it, like where you're feeding this data into the AI models, right? And while there are these striking and persistent biases that you see in the data sets or the data corpus itself, these can also be perpetuated from the AI models, right? Some of these could be generated from the AI models themselves. Do any of you focus on this aspect, or do you address this in your research projects?
Yes, what we are trying to do, I mean, and that's also largely depending on collecting more data from minorities, is to train AI models with as much balanced data as possible. I mean, that is tough. That is, you are still going to see more data from non-Hispanic whites compared to other minorities. This is how data has been collected so far. Yeah, I mean, one effort that we are trying to do is to balance the training set, and we are testing. Is that going to generalize better or not? Other solution which Paula has just suggested is to use transfer learning. That could work well as well, but maybe we want to a kind of mixed solution or try multiple solutions at the same time to see what is the best way to go.
Thank you. Amina?
To follow up on that, we're working also in different projects on rare diseases, and also I have collaborations with NASA where you have N of 1 studies, or very, very, very low sample size and very high dimensional data, which is biomedical data relevant to individuals. So partially there, you're talking about people who are in extreme minorities, and you have to think about new ways potentially of handling that data where you're learning from it. And this reaches to some of the domains that you're interested in and working on and at the forefront of Dhireesha too. Can we develop algorithms which are very good at contextual information and that are more like few shot learning algorithms where you can learn from these rare samples, and that you're also still representative. You can use what you learn from those rare samples to represent a broader population. I think that's where AI can really make an impact, and we're just starting to see where that's going.
Thank you. Paula?
I agree very much with Amina on the rare diseases. At NIH, the NCATS, the National Center for Advanced and Translational Sciences, one of their goals and one of their main functions is to try to support rare diseases. And I think with the genomics and all of that, you know, the reason that patients don't do well or we don't have a treatment is because we really don't understand the disease process. And even things like hypertension are caused by many, many different things. So I do see this as something that really will have to be advanced by understanding each of us as individuals, which is where, once again, precision medicine comes along. Things like pharmacogenomics, where maybe one blood pressure medication works great on me, but not very well on Amina, and knowing which ones those are, will really be able to target and focus the treatments and get much better outcomes with hopefully a lot less trial and error, which is really the way that we do things now. The way a primary care doc does Hypertension is they follow an algorithm that was developed on a large population, and the average was this worked better than that. But it's once again, it's an average, and really none of us are the average. We're all very unique. We're all very different with basic different genetics and social and environmental exposures, and those all have to be taken into account.
Thank you. Yeah, so there is, of course, development in this few short and low short learning algorithms, and hopefully these models can help wherever you have this kind of data representation trouble. But in general, do you see, are there like systemic processes in data collection that can be improved to build inclusive data sets? I mean, you alluded to it again a little bit, whether in the data collection process or recruitment process, but are there any other systemic processes that can be improved? And what do you think is the greatest barrier currently?
Part of it also was a question in the chat. I think we have to allow for free-form representation of how people want to represent themselves, whether it's how they define themselves. So we have to allow for not just check A, B, or C, but always be able to have somebody write in what D is, and to be able to handle it. We don't like that as a data scientist. It's harder for us because it's not easily represented in a single category. So having methods to incorporate that in the very beginning, I think is helpful. And then also methods to handle that type of free form data and the way people might put it in is important.
Thank you. Mohamad?
Yes, I think also one of the main challenges that language barrier could be a kind of reason. We often see, even in San Antonio, patients who do not speak English, and if they prefer to get tested by another language, so how comparable are those tests, and harmonizing tests between different languages, cognitive testing, etc., is an effort. So yeah, and one solution is that we are advancing in that direction by getting more people who are fluent in both languages and can help in in the data collection and recruitment.
If there's one silver lining, and I kind of doubt much, but with COVID-19, it's been the outreach and using remote and telemedicine and telehealth. Of course, that also brings up its disparities. Rural communities often don't have broadband and really have a difficult time of having any type of reliable low socioeconomic status patients. Don't have their laptops like we hold on to dear life, and their iPhones and all the things that we have, which also hurts with connectivity and being able to reach out. But certainly, with the rapid trials that occurred in COVID and recruiting, definitely had to come up with vastly different ways of doing business. And so hopefully some of the lessons learned from this horrible pandemic can be carried on and will improve other aspects of our life beyond the pandemic.
Very much so. It just showcases or highlights the different aspects of the challenges that we have in bringing the data sets or in making this data corpus more representative. And often as AI scientists, we do not dive deeper into these aspects. We take data as it is presented to us and work from there on. And once we do that, even with the AI models itself, you see that there is, they carry this noise that comes from the data into the model, of course. And this noise could be because of what some of the aspects that you have mentioned, like undersampling of the data, or because there is imbalanced data. And they don't work well when we deploy this in the real world. So how challenging is it to address such imbalanced data for the specific problems you're working with? I mean, this might ring really a close bell with Paula, being a clinician. Paula, maybe you want to take a first shot at it.
Well, as alluded to earlier, data quality is a huge issue. And some of the techniques that can be done is to perturb the data, intentionally put errors in to see how robust the algorithm is. Once again, you're testing the algorithms in real world settings that are different. We routinely, of course, hold back some of our data to then test the algorithm to see if it works, but even that is still artificial because it's all technically still retrospective data. And I think the real acid test is the real world settings and do they work well? And there have been some spectacular failures, unfortunately, where everything's been hyped that this is a great algorithm that works really well, but then when you put it into a real world setting, it falls down. So we've got a lot of challenges to do. I'm very confident that AI can help in many, many areas, and I especially think in reducing the cognitive load of clinicians so that they can focus on the critical aspects to the patient. It's so much easier now for patients to say, sit in a waiting room and do surveys, but to say, hey, what is it the patient really is worried about today, rather than what am I, the clinician, worried about today? And hopefully we can have a meeting of the minds. But there are many, many challenges to overcome.
Thank you. Mohamad?
Yes, in neuroimaging, noise is a particular issue. I mean, some sequences, MR kind of images would be more susceptible to noise, motion. I mean, some people in the scanner might move their head a little bit, which would impact the quality of the image. Other MR images could be just susceptible to noise by their nature. I mean, that's an issue. I mean, we try to isolate this kind of noise. If it's motion, we try to get rid of the motions from the scans with a specific tools. So we are building AI tools to do this kind of work. Also which is a particular problem for the segmentation sometimes, like the microbead, which I have just shown. It's by nature is when you train an AI model, you have a super tiny small lesion in the brain and a lot of other voxels, millions of voxels that are just normal, that you want to really know where is the border between both. So that means that we have to do our best to keep this precious data and use them. And it is worth the effort to come up with a deep learning tool that is denoising this data that has costed a lot of dollars as well as time, and use them for training and improving the overall prediction.
So Amina, did you want to add anything to that?
Sometimes tracking the noise is also a benefit. So if you're tracking the noise can be a benefit as well. So tracking the error where it's propagated. As an example, if you're looking at signaling pathways in biology, understanding if a cell is working a certain way. Mohamad mentioned certain region of an MRI image might have a signal and others wouldn't. But you can also say there's error correction in biology, and watching how the error is propagated across the scales can be helpful in the data sets we're working with. To fall back, I think it's also was a question in the chat about also there is noise in a different sense, in that you might want to classify people across many different categories. And then I think yesterday there was a Google Doodle poll out for one of the founders of Fuzzy Logic, and he actually represents many different demographics and is a great person to bring up in this context, because we can handle data in different forms where you don't have to have concrete classifications. I think maybe, and Paula can speak to this, the hard part is then how do you make decisions on therapy? If you have vastly different, if you have probabilistic predictions and you have an overlap in which are the highest ranked therapies for individuals, given the complexity of the algorithm, there still has to be decision. And that connection between, it speaks to Michaela's question, there has to be close conversation between a data scientist and an AI expert saying, this is what we can suggest, this is the best way of equitably handling the data. And it doesn't give you as clean a decision if we handle it this way. And then having the clinician come back and saying, well, how do I interpret that?
Thank you. I think it's more not only the data scientists and the AI experts, but also the domain experts. I mean, I think bringing all of them together and providing them a platform to have this dialogue on an ongoing basis would really be helpful when we are building solutions. Currently, I think we're starting to see that movement, but still a lot of efforts are slightly siloed. And I think the other aspect is, as a student, I think some of the students I can relate to in my own research experience might not understand as to all these nuances or challenges that are associated with the data collection and how that will affect the model that they are building and the solution that is coming out of that AI model. So even for academic institutes to kind of give this training might be very beneficial, looks like it. And that kind of points to what Michaela is asking in the chat, in a much broader context, I guess. So she's asking, do you all see more of a need for better partnerships between municipalities, hospitals, and academia, especially after the pandemic? Paula?
Absolutely. And there are so many barriers to sharing data. Health information exchanges have sprung up, and we have one in San Antonio called HASA, Health Access San Antonio. And not all of the healthcare systems are part of it. I mean, in a perfect world, if a patient gets admitted to Methodist, that they should be able to access all the medical records that happened at University Hospital and all the other places. We're far, far, far from a perfect world when it comes to that. There have been some, the interoperability is a vast challenge. Some of the electronic health records like Epic has Care Everywhere, where if patients agree, different Epic systems. But the other thing that happens is that all that takes time. You really, as a clinician, can't spend 3 hours digging through 15 different areas of medical records. And I think that's where AI, where if it could come and bring what's the important thing that a geriatrician versus a vascular surgeon wants to know and pull all that in so that we're not hunting for it, I think that would be, still the clinician makes the decision, but it definitely decreases the cognitive load. The interoperability and also the barriers around data sharing, which are for good reasons, ethical and moral reasons to protect patient data, but it takes a lot of work to try to be able to share health data across systems. So I think regulatory and also the interoperability and the technical. I think the technical challenges are much easier to solve really than the legal and ethical and regulatory barriers that really get in the way of all the data sharing that I think would be optimal for patient care and for research and for just better outcomes.
Thank you. We are coming to the last 1.5 minutes of our session. So I was wondering if you had some parting thoughts to share with our audience today. Maybe Amina?
Thank you for hosting this panel, Dhireesha and Paula and Mohamad, for being a part, Michaela and Steve and Sarah for hosting. One of the parting things I would say is that it's not just as shown by the panel, it's so many different aspects of developing a research study that involves using AI that can be influenced by the diversity of the data that you're collecting. So it's throughout the idea that equity has to be considered in handling the data is a key thing, and opening up the door to thinking about new ways of designing studies, whether it's thinking about a control group related to what your outcome is. It's a neurosignature versus a different demographic. If you're thinking about N of ones, if you're thinking about an individual as their own control, these are all new ways of or growing ways of handling diversity. And that's just wanted to open up that discussion more. I think there's one more thing in the chat about, are there standards for equitable AI? That's not something we covered, and I don't think that there is any universal standards. So having more discussions like this is an important thing to get that rolling.
Thank you, Amina. Mohamad?
Yes, I mean, I would like just to highlight that with the work that we are doing, we are hoping to come finally at fair AI models so that they are not biased towards any specific group, not gender, not sex, not ethnicity or whatever. But still, no matter what we are going to do, we will still have to work with imbalanced data, and so mathematical solutions to live with this kind of imbalanced data are still needed.
Yeah, Paula.
I think Peter Parker said it best: with great power comes great responsibility. I think there is beautiful aspects of AI that could really make a huge impact and make life better, but we have to be on guard so that it's fair and balanced and equitable. And I'd like to thank the Academic Data Science Alliance and everyone on the panel. It's been a true honor being part of this panel.
Thank you, all of you, for sharing your thoughts on how to use AI technologies for building more inclusive solutions, and that it serves all of us rather than a few. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you, Academic Data Science Alliance, for hosting this panel.
And thank you, Dhireesha, and all of the panelists for joining us today. It was really informative. I think you've got a lot of great discussion in the chat, and I know we have resources we'll post with this video on our YouTube channel when it's ready. I just wanted to close with a reminder to everyone in the audience that next week on December 8th, we are hosting Data Science Conversations, where we'll hear about data science programs at 2 HBCUs, Florida A&M University and Johnson C. Smith University. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Dhireesha, for moderating, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.